And sign off. Is there a noise in the background?
1 second, Baljit, are we live? I don't actually know if we are fully live right now. So, yeah. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 4th edition of the Project 39A annual lecture series in criminal law. I hope you've all had a good day, and as we get ready for the weekend, I hope thoughts from the lecture today can add to some reinvigorated thinking on all of us. I'd just like to say a few words about this lecture first, and I think this year's lecture is going to be incredibly important because I think it urges us not only through rhetoric but also through evidence to think differently about both crime and criminality and criminals, and the interdisciplinary approach that this lecture is taking. I think it promotes a kind of reflexive thinking at an individual but also as a collective, a kind of thinking that is extremely essential and is often missing in public discourse. Having said that, I would like to introduce our guest today. This year's lecture is being delivered by Dr. Pratima Murthy. Dr. Murthy is the director at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, NIMHANS, Bangalore. She's an eminent psychiatrist with over 3 decades of experience in psychiatry and in particular the field of addiction, addiction treatment and care, training, research and policy. Dr. Murthy is also a fellow at the Royal College of Physicians, UK, and has served as the head of Department of Psychiatry, Center for Addiction Medicine and Forensic Psychiatry at NIMHANS. Dr. Murthy, along with 2 other colleagues, Dr. Sanjeev Jain and Dr. Geetanjali Narayanan, who are also at NIMHANS, also guided and mentored the team at Project 39A for our latest report, Deathworthy. Just a quick announcement, we will be taking questions at the end of the lecture. So if you're on YouTube, do put in your questions in the chat and we'll take them after the lecture is over. Thank you, everyone. And a very good evening, Dr. Murthy. Thank you so much for delivering this lecture today. Over to you, Dr. Murthy.
Thank you very much, Murthy. And good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to deliver the 4th Project 39A lecture in criminal law. In this year's lecture, I want to share my thoughts on criminal law and punishment, individual accountability, and social responsibility, and touch upon the idea of the individual itself. Criminal law and processes are a formal mechanism of condemning and prohibiting certain acts such as violence. Trials are conducted to assess evidence, to call into account the suspected individual who may ultimately be pronounced as guilty or not guilty. Guilt is followed by punishment, but not necessarily as the sacred idea of repentance. Depending on which legal philosopher you ask, either the individual deserves the punishment for their own good and to respect their agency, or for the good of society and to protect society from violence. In India, punishment comes in the form of fine, imprisonment, and the death penalty. The individual is caught, held guilty, and punishment is pronounced, all within a legal framework. In today's lecture, I propose a different, I dare say more useful, way of understanding individual violence and criminal behavior, and consequently, criminal punishment. I want to examine what lessons or insights the streams of mental health and social sciences can offer to the idea of capital punishment. After all, these areas deal with questions of the mind, are concerned with behaviors and outcomes, and ultimately focus on the individual's life. But where criminal law seeks to communicate what behaviors may be prohibited. In mental health and social sciences, we're concerned about the roots of certain behaviors and the context in which the individual life develops. Therefore, while the legal discipline is concerned with the concept of guilt, the mental health sciences try and understand the background to a particular behavior exhibited by an individual. These non-legal disciplines and knowledge systems, therefore, form an important companion to criminal law, particularly for matters of punishment. We're all now quite familiar with the varying levels of sensationalism that often accompany reports of violent crimes. We're also equally familiar with the violence that such crimes themselves beget, be it calls for violent punishments or encounters. On these occasions, not only does our need to look at the offense, we may also need to understand not only the harm provokes us, but it also, such violent crimes also color our vision. We see the individual responsible for such criminal acts as an evil entity or as an inherently demonic person. We assume certain traits about the offender, traits that make it easier to imagine the person as not human. But that is our collective imagination. That reality is that this entity is a person, an individual human life which evolved among us in our society. Professor Craig Haney talks about the crime master narrative, a narrative which considers that the entity, the individual, the not human, as existing in a vacuum. It implies that the criminal's thoughts, behaviors, and actions are fixed and unchanged, and that they were always like that. It paints a picture where the criminal act is the direct and sole result of a bad choice and nothing else. That the criminal chose to act a certain way without any internal or external compulsion or influence. One of its assumptions is of unencumbered free will, and that the person who engaged in a certain kind of violence had a knowledge or had a choice to not engage in it, but nonetheless went ahead with it. A similar assumption is at the heart of criminal law and punishment as well. The emphasis is always on the individual's ability to make a choice, whether the law punishes to deter or to communicate to the offender and to society that certain acts are condemnable, and or to indicate to the moral agent that they deserved punishment. But these assumptions on which philosophies and systems of criminal law have been built are turning out to be not true. Research tells us that individual behavior and actions are not the sole domain of the individual, but are influenced by factors far as well as near. We know that free will is not the free will that criminal law presupposes, that our will might be relatively free at best. It is this idea of free will and choice that I'd like us to think about. Our choices, our will, our abilities, and minds are context dependent. They are influenced and developed by factors internal and external to us. I do not suggest that we have no choice, that we have no will, that everything is determined for us and we live through life as automatons. What I am suggesting is that our choices, our will, may not be equally free because our individual contexts are not identical. If we look at the criminal only at the time of the offense, therefore, we may not be able to understand how the violence came to be perpetrated by only looking at the immediate before. We have to zoom out and see the topography to know the terrain of the person's life, and we will find clues on how this person and this violence came to be. Clues that have been empirically linked with violent outcomes. Clues that also tell us where help might have changed the course of the person's life and prevented the crime in the very first place. Let me go on to talk about the biopsychosocial model. This zooming out allows us to investigate the person from what is known as the lens of the biopsychosocial. This model originated in the context of psychiatry and was pioneered by the psychiatrist George Engel. Essentially, this approach looks at mental illness as not just an outcome of individual biological factors, but as a multi-dimensional interplay and an outcome of a complex mix of biological, psychological, and social factors. This model today is the foundation of contemporary theories of human development, which has been established fairly well. And we are not the result of merely nature, and neither are we solely the result of nurture. This biopsychosocial model helps us to understand that human development is the result of a complex, multi-level influence of factors residing both in our nature as well as the processes of nurture in an inextricably fused developmental system. These factors range from genes and individual mental and behavioral functioning to the social and cultural, to ecology, and even history, and play a role in an individual's development from their prenatal stage through their childhood, adolescence, and adult years. In addition to this, we also know that conditions like trauma to the head or epilepsy can also play a part in affecting the individual. And in this trajectory, developmental stages play a crucial part, and consequences of negative or positive experiences at this stage are as if embedded and play a big part throughout our lives. The manner in which the biological, psychological, and social factors shape an individual's life is not just limited to the varied social outcomes or broadly the life circumstances of a person, such as degrees one may have gotten, or income, or social position, but more importantly, the amalgamation of psychosocial factors influence and shape the individual's personality, behavior, the ability to internalize or externalize certain expressions, their perspectives, as well as worldview, their ability to make decisions, their ability to control actions, and so on. There is now overwhelming evidence that the model holds keys to explain and contextualize violent behaviors as well. There's a famous study by the noted the psychologist Walter Mischel, which tested self-control in children around 4 years and made connections with how they performed in later life. The marshmallow test, as it's popularly known as, offered children food of their preference, such as marshmallows, candies, or cookies, as a way to test self-control. If the child waited for some time, they got 2 items. But if they immediately ate their candy or cookie, they could not get the second one. The study found that children who waited also did better at academics. But importantly, the study found that children who did not display the skill of self-control were largely from poorer households. There were social factors which were shaping their behavior and the eventual outcome, or whether they did better at school. This is a crucial connection. The takeaway was not just that children with self-control do better, or that children from poorer families have no control. It was that there are psychological influences of poverty, such as response to resource scarcity, that the children may be motivated by. These are factors entirely invisible if one were to narrowly focus on the short transaction of waiting or taking the candy, but which were actually governing the person's behavior. Let me give you another example. The famous story of Phineas Gage. Born in 1823, young Phineas worked in railroad construction, and he had an unfortunate accident. A doctor who knew him before the accident described him as a perfectly healthy, strong, and active young man, possessing an iron will as well as an iron frame, a muscular system unusually well developed, having had scarcely a day's illness from his childhood until the date of the injury. In an unusual accident, an iron rod pierced Phineas's skull and brain right through to his jaw. Phineas survived the accident, though he suffered a serious brain injury. But was he really Phineas anymore? Post his injury, Phineas's personality was said to have changed to such an extent that he was no longer Gage. There was a biological alteration in Phineas Gage's personality, which he did not cause, but which affected him at such a level that it changed his personality. Once again, here we see the interplay between biological, psychological, and social factors that brought about changes in Phineas Gage that he could not control. People with brain injuries are known to be aggressive and violent. A more recent incident comes to mind. Earlier this year in the United States, a former football player, Philip Adams, shot dead 6 people. He then shot himself as well. What led to a successful, rich football player to murder so many? It turns out that Adams had a degenerative brain disease, CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a disease which is linked to repeated head trauma or brain injury. He had no past criminal record, and yet this violence. In fact, studies show that instances of brain injuries are very common in the prison population. But just like the marshmallow test, it would not be quite accurate to say that people with brain injuries will commit more crime. I think a more nuanced way to understand it in this way, brain injury may bring about changes in an individual's personality, control, and regulation. And when unsupported, and when not helped by medication as well, or when requisite support is not provided, it may lead to violence. What I am trying to say is that there is no one determinative factor for violence, but when certain circumstances come together, circumstances which are not always in the control of the person, things can go very wrong. With respect to criminality or individual violence too, there are factors from among the spectrum of biopsychosocial factors which have been identified as risk factors. These factors can be identified in the individual as well as in the environment. Many of you know of something called adverse childhood experiences, which are interrelated negative experiences coupled with a lack of positive factors in a child's family, community, and social environment. These could include poverty, childhood neglect, absent parent figures, parental substance use, dropping out of school early, etc. And these factors have repeatedly been linked with violence in later life. It is not that each factor directly causes violence or that there is a causal link between these factors and violence, but they are predictive of violence, including sexual violence. The presence of these risk factors in the individual's life makes him or her more vulnerable to aggression or violence as compared to another individual whose life might have been protected from such risk factors if they had the right kind of support. Let me offer you a real life example of Jai Kumar. This name, of course, has been changed to protect the identity of the individual, but the facts that I narrate are real and were collected during the fieldwork for Deathworthy, a recently released report by Project 39A, in which 2 of my colleagues at NIMHANS, Dr. Jain and Dr. Gitanjali, as well as myself, were associated. This is the story of Jai Kumar, who was born into a rural family of farmers. He was a naughty and stubborn child and would often pick up fights with other children and break their things. The reasons for these fights was never very clear. He would often miss school. His parents and older siblings would farm and contribute to the family's earnings. Days on which Jai Kumar would miss school, he'd smoke bidis, and soon the bidis turned to ganja. Left unattended, he would smoke with the people around him, and he was part of a peer group which smoked ganja a lot. And ganja was available easily enough with babas and naths smoking substances. Jai Kumar eventually dropped out of school soon after class 5 and joined his family on the farm. By 12, he had started engaging in self-harming behaviors and would also sometimes hurt others. He was married at 18 years, but much like his inability to attend school, he was not regular at work either. By this time, he'd become dependent on ganja and would often be high for long parts of the day. He would hit his wife and children. He would file false FIRs Thinking that people were out to get him, he started sleeping with a sword next to him. His brother would refer to him as a madman. And though he was taken to a local healer for Jadpuk, he was never able to access formal mental health care services. When he was around 50 years old, Jaikumar ended up killing his wife and 5 of his 6 children. He was sentenced to death. Looking at the broader terrain of Jaikumar's life, one is able to see not only that his choices themselves were limited, but also that the extent of choice-making avenues which can allow considered and informed choice-making were equally compromised. It is therefore not as simple to just conclude, but did he know that the act was wrong? He did, and accountability must ensue. But it raises the question that with avenues which promote conditions of considered choice-making being absent, to what extent is he solely responsible? If a person has seen their world in only 2 colors, black and white, even the possibility that the color purple may exist is beyond their realm of consideration, and it will therefore impact their choices and their decisions. If someone were to ask them, what color do they like? The options available to them are only black, white, and perhaps grays. This is what I mean when I say that the choices themselves are limited, and the consequent extent to choice making is therefore restricted. The importance of the biopsychosocial model is that it provides context. In providing context, it also offers possible solutions. If there had been an intervention early in Jaikumar's life, such as a safe space for school, could his substance use have been avoided? Could the subsequent events of his life taken a different turn? Did he actively decide to consume substances? Yes, he decided, but at what age? What behavior was seen as desired and therefore to be followed? Had there been someone to pay attention and to guide him? Could they have realized the reasons for Jaikumar's bad performance at school? But the family's poverty meant that everyone was working with little time to notice Jaikumar's behavior and realize that he needed support. Was he psychotic? Was it induced by cannabis? Had Jaikumar been able to access quality treatment for his mental health, or had he been able to access support for his substance use, would things have been different for Jaikumar? I think the answer is undoubtedly yes. There is a vast time difference, of course, between his not going to school and using substances and when he committed the offense. But one can trace right back to his childhood that there were crucial and glaring cracks in his life. Seen from this lens, while these were choices, in much as they were his decisions, the question is, how considered were his choices? How free from his unhelpful social surroundings, for instance, was his will? Jaikumar is responsible for his decisions and for the ensuing consequences for himself and people he may have harmed or hurt. Not holding him responsible would also take away his agency. But how much is he responsible, and how much is the lack of support and the lack of protective factors and the presence of adverse experiences responsible for getting him to the point where the law found him? The idea that crime is the outcome of one individual acting at one given point, unaffected by their past or current, brushes aside the realities of both how violence and criminal behavior come about. These neural connections between our present and past are neither causal, determinative, nor visible, but a life spent with little or no positive intervention, secure surroundings, and healthy resources in its multiple forms, such as nurturance, financial stability, and health resources in its multiple helpful support, healthy food, healthy guidance, and avenues for growth also prevent us from realizing our fullest potential, from being fully formed moral beings. As criminal law imagines, all or at least most of its subjects to be. And that is really the irony. I do not intend for moral in this context to be a value system of lesser or greater worth, but I refer more to the idea of a moral self and the process of coming into. To become the moral agents that criminal law and punishment require and seemingly promote requires the pre-existence and continuity of certain conditions. To be held equally accountable then, the prerequisite is that such conditions be equally available to all individuals to aid the realization of their fullest potential, to fully form themselves, and therefore to become equally moral. And the reality is that this may not be true. We know that, for instance, more than 70% of death row prisoners are from socially and economically vulnerable and marginalized communities. In other words, more than 70% of them do not have the prerequisite conditions for realizing a fully formed self and exercising their free will. In fact, they were in varying stages of unfreedom, if you could put it that way. Let's look at the relationship between the offender and the punishment next. What then can criminal law borrow from the biopsychosocial lens? Very broadly, criminal law is meant to communicate society's opprobrium of certain actions and to hold accountable the person responsible for such actions punitively. As custodian of social values and society, criminal law establishes a direct link with each individual and with society itself. It is a social institution. The political theory and economy of criminal law, its necessity and sufficiency, and its larger role in society are all issues extremely relevant to what I'm talking about today. But for today, I want to start with the presumption or assumption that criminal law and the punitive consequences it entails as punishment is a legitimate state response to violence, regardless of which exact philosophical purpose it may intend to fulfill. Instead, let's shift our focus to the subjects of criminal law. How does criminal law imagine its subject to be? The essence of the individual whose behavior it seeks to regulate. And it would appear that as a starting point, the subject of criminal law is an abstraction in the exact same condition as the next and equally free and unconstrained to will, choose, and perform their actions. And of course, who share equally the values that the instrumentality of the law seeks to promote. The exceptions are then identified, which largely focus on the immediate and proximal mental state of the person: duress, necessity, insanity, self-defense, and many others. Actions done under these states are not freely chosen because the essential condition of the imagined individual is now changed since their free will is now encumbered. The tools of criminal law lend themselves to establish causal responsibility. Who caused the harm? And questions of intent, motive, knowledge, etc. are addressed, among other things. As an aside, defenses like the insanity defense are a yes, but scenario. Yes, A caused the harm, but A is not guilty. The idea of criminal punishment is broader. It has elements of both causal and moral responsibility. Criminal punishment embodied the idea and penal accountability for the harm caused, and its aims have been theorized by many: retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and even reform. But even while punishment is meant to be delivered to the individual, theories of punishment rarely focus on the individual. The interest is to prevent crime and protect society. Retributive theories aim for punishment to be proportionate to the harm caused. Deterrence focuses on deterring similar harm from being caused again. Incapacitation seeks to protect society from the individual, and reform tries to align the individual with socially and commonly held value systems so that the person can be a part of society. Following in the tradition of criminal law generally, theories of punishment too seem to view individuals as abstract, unattached, fully formed entities with little variation. The abstract individual imagined by the theories of punishment is one who is and was always fully realized and fully formed, and who decided to inflict harm. Causal responsibility having been decided, how do we decide moral responsibility and how much to punish? And it is here that the zooming out that I spoke about before is so crucial. To be able to determine responsibility, moral responsibility, one has to necessarily undertake an investigation into first whether the person is fully formed and a fully realized person that the theory and idea of punishment imagined. And to do so, we need to be able to zoom out, to look at the entire context of the person being punished, because only then will we be in a position to understand the forces that form their moral being from the time they were born. It is in this that the biopsychosocial lens helps. It is at the same time a framework of analysis and a guidebook to the explorer of what factors to look for towards determining the moral responsibility of the person. Examined under this lens, the context of the person will reveal the forces that help them become, not just factors and facts observable to the naked eye, but much like the marshmallow experiment, it will reveal the psychological and the subterranean. And it will perhaps reveal something else, gaps and barriers. Gaps and barriers routinely added and consistently magnified, which remained unaddressed because of sorely lacking social support structures as well as intervention. The question that is eventually raised is this: who is responsible for an individual's moral becoming? Our context is in large part responsible. For instance, a person growing up in poverty is far more likely to be thwarted in their development and moral becoming than a person who is growing up in relative stability. Attendance of poverty, such as childhood neglect, abuse, dropping out of school, early adultification, early substance use, are crucially connected parts of the neural network that becomes us. The network spreads out, charting its path and its cumulative strengths and weaknesses, lies in individual experiences. These are the distal circumstances that are strongly connected to more proximal events and eventually the offender before the court. They certainly were there in Jayakumar's life. Without examining these distal occurrences, we would not be able to determine how fully formed an individual was, and eventually to what extent does the person fit in the law's imagined offender attributes. Coming back to the question, who is responsible for an individual's moral becoming? And I think the answer necessarily has to be, we are not solely responsible for our being, for our becoming, for who we are. The responsibility is shared between us and our social context, us and society, us and the presence, or often in cases of criminality, the lack of support that was indeed necessary but was not present. And this must play a role in deciding how morally responsible a person is for a particular act. What then can we conclude? A biopsychosocial lens to violence and criminality reveals an uncomfortable reality for criminal law and punishment. That when deciding how much to punish, in deciding individual accountability, we must look at social responsibility. at the often unfulfilled responsibility of the state and of society. And I think we need to therefore collectively reflect, respond, and take responsibility. We are not born fully formed, our thoughts clear, and our morality inherent. But through daily interactions with environments around us, we go through a constant becoming. And we often find clues if we were to shift our gaze to the criminal in their context, that the processes of becoming is likely to have been thwarted oftentimes and in multiple ways. That is what Jaykumar's case story illustrates. There is no one aspect directly causing an outcome, and there is no one predetermined outcome. And that is the essential learning and question. Had there been systems of effective support in his life, would he still have ended up where he did, killing his family and landing up in prison? The consistent lack of necessary social and structural support systems from a very young age, and dare say, the lack of medical intervention at a timely phase of his life, ended up in a tragedy, not only for those who passed away, but also for Jaykumar. His life, in a way, is a tragedy too. And if I may offer a suggestion, I think systems of punishment need to engage with practitioners of these knowledge streams to fully make sense of the complex lives of the many who come before it for justice. Criminal law, its theory and practice are vast and complex fields, and talking about all aspects in one lecture would not do them justice. There are many things that, of course, go in delivering punishment. There is the judge's own developmental trajectory that may play a factor, the human element in judging, so to say. There's the system's ability to fully investigate and appreciate these complexities, rules of procedure and evidence that may play a part in how criminal law punishes, and so on. We haven't engaged in many of these issues. I'm sure that would take another lecture. Today was perhaps a conversation starter, which we can all in our respective works and studies take forward, reflect, and develop. Through this lecture, I did not intend to provide any answers or solutions, but I wanted to share a few thoughts that I have also had to grapple with in the course of my own work. And of course, the work that we did as part of the Project 39A, looking at people on the death row. Whether the solution is to do away with certain punishments or to incorporate it in our current criminal law and punishment schemes, or to revisit theories of criminal law and punishment, or indeed strengthen and ensure social justice policies that can effectively intervene early on and, when crucial, to eventually and collectively prevent violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murthy, for that lecture. It was extremely thought-provoking, and yeah, I think what the contours of what you have laid down today, like I said earlier, also, it's not just reflexive. I think, in a way, it tries to promote a sort of empathetic approach, both in the law and in our individual and public dialogue and conversations. I think that empathy is what I think gets sort of attracted when we start talking about things like context, to start really looking at people in their full thriving and sometimes lacking context. And I think that's an important part for us to remember every single time that there is a response to violence in our lives, in our public discourse. And so thank you so much for that, Dr. Murthy. I had a few questions, and then perhaps we can take audience questions. I'm just going to take the opportunity to pick your brains on a few things. So I think one of the things that often comes up in a conversation like this, when we talk about context, is that uh, not everybody who goes through the same context or similar context will end up, say, committing a crime. And so how do we, what might the response to that be? Or is it all just a matter of chance and luck?
I think any kind of very simplistic logic wouldn't work. We all know that poor people don't necessarily all indulge in crime. That's again, I think it's ridiculous to say that. And at the same time, we know that when there is a collection of disadvantage, it's like almost like you peel the layers of an onion. And you, for example, when you see in Jai Kumar's case, poverty is one of the elements. Maybe the absence of a family is another element, and that's very often linked with poverty because you have to go out to work, and therefore you don't have the time and the ability to nurture. Okay, even though you might have a very nurturing attitude, you might just have no opportunity to nurture. And then, of course, you look at substance use, you look at working very early, you look at self-harm behavior, which might either be related to the substance use or to the individual's personality. So when it is a constellation, so when you look at it, you peel off like the layers of the onion, you see so many different things co-occurring. So no one thing might have actually led this person to this situation. It is the complex interplay of multiple things. And that's why the biopsychosocial lens is worth kind of applying to this. Jai Kumar had all these disadvantages. Another person might have had a brain trauma. And we've noticed that several people, and we talked about the sports person in the United States who had repeated trauma to his brain, and therefore that changed his personality. So when you have a complex, we know now that very poor nutrition can actually change the development of your brain. And again, when that kind of adds to the complexity, you probably have a very different outcome. And I think it's important to appreciate this complex interplay of disadvantage.
Yeah. So in a way, we don't, comparing people is futile unless we have full information about both.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to sort of refer to one of the things that you said about whether criminal law and punishment processes currently are equipped. I think one of the biggest things that we are taught as lawyers is to be, I don't know if that's the correct word, but to be objective, to always, like, there's a big, I think criminal law particularly, there's a big focus on cause and effect. And I guess what you're also saying is that there is no cause and effect. I think we discussed it in a different context about, how do we look at a forensic scene, a crime scene, and not looking at it as from a criminal law, but as from a personal biopsychosocial lens. It completely changes the story. So is there, if there is no cause and effect, then is it that we look at everything, that criminal law for punishment needs to look at every thing to be able to really decide? And then how is that possible?
So, and I think if we even, go to that space where we say, look, we need to look beyond the obvious. I think that is my objective, the objective of my lecture fulfilled in some ways, because I think that is what the law needs to do, which is really understand that a circumstance or an event is not a single act that you look at. It's not just, and I think you mentioned as a lawyer how you learn to, approach things objectively. And I don't think looking at a developmental perspective is not looking at things objectively. It is just expanding your gaze and objectively look at the various kinds of factors that have culminated in the individual landing up in this circumstance. So I believe it is as objective as, as anything else. But I think the intent then changes to understanding why this person has reached here, and not just that the person has committed the crime and therefore this is the consequence. And what I spoke about earlier is that you can't kind of put everybody in the same latitude in terms of either morality or personhood, that we are all as different. People talk about neurodiversity in the context of, understanding various disorders from autism to dementia, etc. But we don't apply the same neurodiversity principle to this group. And we've seen from evaluating people who are involved in crime that certainly there is a huge amount of neurodiversity. And when you combine neurodiversity with the ecology or the environment that they're growing up in, the lack of the supportive systems that we've talked about, the disadvantage that we've talked about, then you understand that this individual, was really the result of a complex, unfortunate set of circumstances.
And I think the advantage, like you pointed out, the advantage of the biopsychosocial model is it's not actually asking you to look at everything. It's telling you what are the important things to look at, and even giving you sort of, how do you try and figure out this interplay. So I think, it's not that you go on a wild goose chase. That's not what you're doing. If you have a trained professional with you, they'd know where to look.
Yeah. And let me say, Murthy, another thing is that, you obviously, you need to balance out the adversities in a person's life with the interventions that have occurred to diminish or mitigate the, the disadvantage.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, you'll find that in these individuals, that mitigation of these circumstances have not occurred. There are lots of examples where people are disadvantaged, and when they're properly supported, they're able to, be whatever, be integrated in society, fulfill their potential, and so on. It is just that there is a group of people who do not have the advantage or who do not have the opportunity to overcome these disadvantages, and they only then increase exponentially to produce.
Right. So there are some YouTube questions which I'm going to now ask. So one person asks, in our current practice, empathy during public discourse when there's a crime is generally evoked in the context of the victim. Now, should we extend this, I'm not going to say empathy, but courtesy to the accused as well?
I don't want to use either empathy or courtesy because I think both have shortfalls. I mean, any one of us would empathize naturally with the victim because you tend to see, you tend to see the violence, the meaninglessness of such an act and the kind of distress it causes to all around us. I think what we need to understand is that this is inevitable. I mean, your empathy towards the victim is inevitable, but in that, is our justice system going to be compromised? Because if it is, then I think the punishment or the extent of the punishment does not take into view the entire trajectory that we've been talking about. And I believe that it's neither empathy nor courtesy, but I think it's a responsibility of the judicial system to look at all these factors and to pronounce the judgment and the punishment in the context of these. And if we could just move the discourse to being able to understand this and very logically and objectively determine how these could have influenced the person's current state and condition, I think that would be the movement forward.
Yeah, and I think as a policy, at a policy level as well, I think if we do want a more healthy society at a larger macro level, if you want a society where there's little crime, I don't think we can do with no crime, but reduced crime. I think we need to address a lot of the factors that you spoke about, the social support structures, the medical intervention that you spoke about, because you see, say substance use, there is so much you see on the streets with the little kids, and not determinative, but you know that this is not going to end well for any of them, anyone around them. Yeah, I have another question. Considering that the biopsychosocial model, what the biopsychosocial model posits, how far is it safe to say that no offense whatsoever inherently deserves punishment, and the sole intervention for any offender should be rehabilitation? So no punishment, only rehabilitation.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in a completely ideal world, the focus actually needs to be on rehabilitation, you know. But we don't live in an ideal world with all the capacity for, conducting rehabilitation. But our purpose is obviously to make, perhaps to ensure the person doesn't, recommit an offense or modify themselves. But that doesn't occur if you put a person away. Unless you work on various things. I mean, just the example of that individual I spoke about, if there's a traumatic brain injury and you haven't done anything to improve the person's emotional regulation or the cognition, how is the person going to be able to adapt? And that is the complex challenge of rehabilitation itself. But I would look at it in a different way. I think these are conversations that necessitate us as a society to think of how we could have actually limited this transitioning from an adverse event in childhood, from trauma, to emotional dysregulation, to use of substances, to getting engaged in petty crime, to committing a heinous crime. So there were so many times in which, if we as a vigilant and caring society had actually intervened, we could have prevented the progression of A to B, B to C, C to D, and then finally where it's ended up. So that's one very important message that I think as a society we need to take. The second, of course, is the event having occurred, understanding it in the context of the past, and then determining what the future should be. If we can even, try and focus on that, I think it would be a very important progressive step in jurisprudence.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we need to take the conversation.
So coming to jurisprudence, there's a question. I think this is a complex question and the answer is going to be complex, but so some courts go down the tricky path of seeing whether there's a risk of future offending. So, I mean, in the US, that's very often used, I think in a lot of jurisdictions, of when a person is being released for parole hearings, etc., there'll be a risk assessment if the person is going to engage in offending again, re-engage. And I think what we have seen, and it's there everywhere, not just here, is that seems to be an absolute belief that something like this can be predicted with 100% certainty. So one is that question: is there that kind of what's risk offending or future offending assessments? To what extent can we actually do that? And I think my second question is, even that future offending, to what extent is not the individual, but the social circumstance is going to be responsible for even that future offending. So if you could give your comments on that.
I'm just going to go off at a bit of a tangent and talk about something else before I come to answer your question. And this was because I was at the Central Prison in Bangalore just last week, and and I was talking about this, an experience that we had a few years ago when we were working in the Central Prison, about a woman offender. She had served her sentence in the prison and was going to be discharged, and she had a mental health problem. She went out of prison and came back a couple of days later crying and wanting to let back into the prison because she didn't have any facilities for her basic needs: food, shelter, medication, forget job, and so on. So I think somewhere along the line, even for non-violent, whatever, I mean, in the general run of the mill, we do not have any kind of rehabilitative facilities. So I think we really need to think very carefully of how, even though we put people away, are we really preparing them, supporting them? I mean, we talked about the lack of support when they were children and from society, from their immediate environment. But as a system, what is the support that we are providing to rehabilitate them is something that we need to ask ourselves. The second thing is the prediction of violence. There are ways in which you can predict it, but there are equally also steps that you need to take precautions to make sure that this doesn't occur in society. And there are so many different ways of doing that. Again, there are no easy answers, and there is no 100% foolproof method. But I think, again, we need to start thinking about what it is that we can do. Can we restitute some of the functions of this individual so that the risk of reoffense does not occur? If the person is so badly, in such a bad shape that the society needs to be protected from them, where exactly can this person be looked after? I think these are all questions for which we don't have answers, but we need to start thinking about it. And, the proof of pudding will be when we actually have cases where we demonstrate that we can change the discourse. And I think it's about that. It's about having judgments which look at it differently and which show that there are alternatives to the way we are looking at it. We have a certain gaze at the moment. We want to know that there are alternative gazes and see whether those alternative gazes help us to understand this whole thing and be a better society.
Yeah, I think it just reminds me of a lot of sort of discourse that happens in when people attempt suicide and they are put in hospitals. Can they be released? Are they at risk of attempting suicide again? And I think there in that field, the mental health discourse there is that you need to address social structures around this person. The risk is not inherent in the person. There is a social structure to be built and emotional support, prevention, all of that. But I think when it comes to criminal activity or violence to others, we don't think around the same lines. We just seem to assume that all violence is purely inherent. And I think what your lecture is indicating and sort of urging us to think away from that and more social. And that, I think that brings me to a little bit of a somewhat a controversial opinion, maybe a controversial suggestion. But I was just, is it when we are punishing, we punish individual violence with individual punishment? But if what you're saying, the biopsychosocial through evidence has shown us that it's not just one individual. There are individual factors, but there's so much else happening. One is that considering we are talking about lack of social responsibility, are we somewhere when we're talking about range of punishments and where is the individual being placed in that range? Are we somewhere also talking individual versus social responsibility? I don't know if that was clear, that we are distributing responsibility between this individual harm causer and depending on what all was missing in their lives, also saying this society needed to have been more active to protect this person through structures or supports. So in that individual punishment paradigm, we are equally saying, yeah.
Okay, let me try and answer that question and take your other question and the comment about suicide and homicide. The thing is, I mean, again, going back to what I was referring to assume that the person has a certain moral compass or has a certain free will. We need to, I mean, we are equating everybody on the same, at the same level, but we know that the social circumstances, and not just social circumstances, the innate biological structure of the individual interacting with the social circumstances produces a wide range of morality or will, if you will. And therefore, and looking at every single event with the same gaze may actually be erroneous because of the underlying differences in what leads to development of the will or morality is the biggest problem ahead of all of us. Now, whether it's suicide or whether it's homicide, it is the combination of not just biological factors, because suicide could also occur because of mental illness, as well as we discuss, a lot of social, adversities or, situations which can render this. So I think it's in both conditions. And I think you used a very good analogy. I think the important thing is really to look not just at the act. For example, dismiss somebody who tries, makes a suicidal attempt, and saying, "Oh, it was just circumstance; it won't occur again." Because I think adopting the same kind of perspective to understand, hey, what led this individual to reach this stage in suicide of desperation, in homicide of violence. So I think you're asking similar questions, and the formative aspects to each may be somewhat similar, maybe quite divergent, but I think the ability to ask these questions and not to be myopic in the way one looks at offense is very important.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Murthy. It's 7 o'clock, so I should wrap up. Thank you everyone for watching the lecture, and I hope you enjoyed it. I will just leave with one last comment for the weekend, and it is to sort of engaging in this work. What I have concluded as of now is that we might, I do not think punishment is anymore, given where our understanding in social sciences human behavior is. I don't think it is a matter of criminal law. I think it's a big combination of social justice issues and criminal law aims and criminal justice aims. And with that, I will leave these thoughts with you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Murthy. It was a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you for asking me. It was wonderful to actually think about all these things and introspect on some very, very important questions. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much.